She was 18 years old, and she had $3 knotted in the corner of a handkerchief, and on the morning this story begins, she stood at the edge of a drowned hole in the ground and bought it from a man who could not believe his luck. Her name was Ruth Hollis, and the thing she bought was the old coreless quarry outside the town of Bishop's Ford in the dry hills of eastern Oregon. A great square pit 200 feet across that had filled with green water 40 years before and had been, ever since, worth exactly nothing to anybody. The man who sold it to her was the county tax agent, and he had come out to Bishop's Ford to clear the forfeit lots off the books, and the flooded quarry was the worst of them. A lot so worthless that it had sat unsold through 3 auctions, because a hole full of water is not land you can farm or graze or build upon, but only a danger to be fenced. When the girl with the handkerchief asked its price, he told her $3, meaning it as a kind of joke, the lowest sum the county would take to make a lawful sale. And when she untied her handkerchief and counted the $3 onto his ledger, he stopped smiling. Because a joke that is taken seriously stops being a joke and becomes a strange thing you have to think about. "You understand there's nothing there," he said to her. "It's a hole full of water, 40 years of rain. You can't drain it, you can't fill it, you can't do a thing with it but drown in it." "I understand," Ruth Hollis said, and she did understand, better than he knew. She took her paper of sale and she folded it small and she walked back to town, and by the time she got there, the whole of Bishop's Ford had heard that the Hollis girl, cast out not a week past, had spent her last $3 on the drowned quarry, and the town shook its head over it the way a town does, half pity and half scorn, and went back to its business and forgot her. But what the town did not know, and what Ruth Hollis had told no one, was why a penniless girl would spend her last coins on a hole full of water. She had a reason. It was a reason her dead father had given her, in the last winter of his life, and she had carried it alone for 2 years because there had been no one she dared tell. To understand it, you have to go back. Ruth had grown up in Bishop's Ford, the daughter of a stonecutter named Amos Hollis, a quiet, careful man who had come out from Vermont in his young manhood to work the quarries when the quarries were the making of the town. For Bishop's Ford had been a stone town. Once, the coreless quarry above it had cut a pale fine granite prized all up and down the coast, and it had been shipped out by the wagon load for the courthouses and banks and fine houses of a growing country, and the town had grown fat and proud on the cutting of it. Amos Hollis had been the best of the cutters, a man who could read a block of stone the way a scholar reads a page, who knew by the grain and the ring of it where it would split true and where it would shatter. And he had risen to be the master cutter of the coreless works, trusted with the finest and most costly stone. He had taught his daughter the trade the way a man teaches the thing he loves, not as work but as a kind of seeing. On Sundays, when the works were still, he would take Ruth up among the great blocks and put his hand on the cool stone and have her lay her small hand beside it, and he would tap the block with the flat of a chisel and have her listen to the note it gave. A sound block rang clear and long, he told her, a tone that lived in the air after the striking. A block with a hidden flaw, a seam or a shatter waiting inside, gave back a short dead sound with no life in it, and a cutter who could hear the difference could save himself a week of ruined labor. He taught her to read the grain, the faint lines in the stone that showed which way it wished to break, so that a wedge set right would part a ton of granite clean as an apple, and a wedge set wrong would only shatter it to gravel. He taught her that stone did not lie. A man might lie, and the weather might deceive, and the eye might be fooled, but stone was exactly what it was, all the way through, and it kept its truth forever if you only knew how to read it. She was a girl of 9 and 10 learning to hear the ring of granite beside her father, and she did not know that he was giving her the one gift that would, long after he was gone, undo the great wrong of both their lives. And then, 40 years before this story begins, the quarry had flooded, and the town had begun to die. The flooding was the thing the town could never explain, and the not explaining of it had grown, over the years, into a kind of ghost story. The coreless quarry had struck water. That happened in quarries. A deep cut could break into an underground spring and begin to fill. But the Corliss flood had come fast and strange, in a single night, and it had come at the worst possible moment. For it came on the very night that the quarry's greatest work was nearing completion. The Corliss works had taken a commission grander than any in its history, a commission from the state capitol itself for a set of carved stone pieces to crown the new Capitol building, and the finest of that stone, the great finished carvings that represented 2 years of the master cutter's art, had been down in the deep of the pit awaiting the wagons that would carry them to the Capitol. And in the night the water had come, and by morning the pit was drowned 200 feet deep, and the carvings, and the tools, and the whole labor and fortune of the Corliss works lay under green water, and the water never went down again. The Corliss Company failed. The commission was lost. The Capitol gave its work to a quarry in another state. And Bishop's Ford, its one industry drowned in a night, began the long, slow slide into the poor, half-empty town it had become by the time Ruth Hollis was a girl. And the reason the town could never explain was this: no spring was ever found. The engineers who came, in the years after, to see whether the pit might be pumped and worked again, could find no source for the water. It did not drain, and it did not sink, and it did not answer to any pump they set to it. It was as though the earth had simply decided to swallow the Corliss works, and the town had come, in its bitterness, to speak of the drowned quarry as a cursed place, and to leave it alone. But Amos Hollis had known better, and in the last winter of his life, wasted with the fever that would take him, he had told his daughter the truth he had never dared tell another soul, because the truth was dangerous, and because he had been afraid, and his fear had been the great shame of his life. The quarry had not flooded by accident. It had been flooded on purpose, and Amos Hollis had known the man who did it, because he had seen him do it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Hollis, and the drowned quarry, and the drought that gave up at last what had lain 40 years beneath the green water. And if a story of buried truth and patient courage is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what part of this wide country you're watching from. We're glad of your company in the dark. The man who had flooded the quarry was named Caleb Voss, and 40 years on, though he was old now, he was still the most powerful man in the county, for he owned the bank at Bishop's Ford and a great deal of the land around it, and the story of how he had come to own it was a story that everyone knew the surface of, and no one knew the truth beneath. The surface was this: when the Corliss works failed, Caleb Voss, then a young and rising man, had been the one with money enough to buy up the ruined company's lands and debts, and he had built from that ruin the fortune that made him. The town thought him shrewd. The town thought he had seen opportunity in another man's disaster and seized it, which is a thing men admire even as they envy it. But the truth Amos Hollis had carried to his deathbed was that Caleb Voss had not found the disaster. He had made it. Voss had wanted the Corliss lands, and the Corliss Company would not sell, for it was prospering. And so, on the night the great Capitol carvings lay finished in the deep of the pit, Caleb Voss and 2 men in his pay had gone up to the quarry in the dark, and had done a thing that only a man who understood the works could have done. They had not found a spring. They had opened one. There was a channel high in the hills above the quarry, where the Corliss Company had long ago dammed a mountain stream aside to keep it out of the workings, and Voss and his men had broken that dam in the night and turned the whole weight of the mountain's water down into the pit, and by morning the works were drowned, and the dam's ruin looked, to any who came after, like the failure of an old and forgotten earthwork, a thing of chance and neglect. No spring was ever found, because there was no spring. There was only a broken dam high in the hills that the water had long since worn into a shape that told no tales. Amos Hollis had seen it. He had gone up to the quarry that night for a tool he had forgotten, and from the dark of the hillside he had seen Caleb Voss and his men at the dam, and he had understood, and he had been afraid. He was a stonecutter with a young wife and a daughter not yet born, and Caleb Voss was a man on his way to owning the county, and Amos Hollis had done the thing that the weak and the frightened do, which is nothing. He had gone home and held his tongue and watched the town die around him, and he had lived 40 years with the knowing of it, and it had made him quiet, and it had made him careful, and it had, in the end, broken something in him that no man ever saw was broken. On his deathbed he told his daughter not to burden her, but because a man cannot carry such a thing into the ground, and he needed one living soul to know that he had known. The carvings are still down there, he told her in the last of his strength. 2 years of my life, Ruthie, the best I ever cut. They're down in the deep of the pit where the water took them, and the truth of what Voss did is down there with them, if a body could ever reach it. But no body ever will. It's 200 feet of water and 40 years, and I'm a coward that let it lie. He died that winter. And 2 years later, Ruth Hollis, who had gone to live with her father's cousin, and had been cast out by that cousin's new husband the week this story begins, stood at the edge of the drowned quarry with $3 in a handkerchief, and did the one thing she had been planning, quietly, since the night her father told her the truth. She bought the hole, for she had understood something that her grieving, frightened father at the end of his life had not been in a state to weigh. He had said no body would ever reach the bottom of that pit, and that was true, so long as the pit was full. But Amos Hollis had told her something else, years before, in the good years, when he used to talk to her about the works. He had told her that the coreless quarry did not flood from below. It had no spring, which meant the water in it was only what had come from above, from 40 years of rain and the one great drowning night, with nowhere to drain and nowhere to sink. And water that is only fed from above, in a dry country, in a pit of solid granite, does one thing across the years that water fed by a spring never does. In a drought, it falls. And Ruth Hollis, standing at the edge of the pit that first morning as its lawful owner, looked at the green water and saw what no one else in Bishop's Ford had troubled to see, that it was lower than it had been when she was a girl. 2 dry years had passed. The whole of eastern Oregon was in the grip of a drought that had the farmers praying, and the wells running low, and the creeks gone to gravel, and the drowned quarry, fed by nothing but a sky that had forgotten how to rain, had dropped a slow and steady foot each year, and the pale ring of dried stone around its rim, the mark of where the water once had stood, was as plain to Ruth Hollis's eye as a line drawn on a wall. She did not have to drain the quarry. She had only to wait, and to watch, and to let the dry sky do the work her father had thought impossible. The drought that was breaking the county was, for Ruth Hollis, the answer to a prayer. So she waited. And this is the part of the story that the town would tell longest in the years after, though at the time they only thought her mad. For the better part of a year, the cast-out Hollis girl lived alone at the edge of the drowned quarry. She built herself a lean-to of scrap against the old quarry office, and she took what work she could in town to keep herself fed, washing and mending and hoeing other people's gardens. And every evening she walked back out to the pit, and she drove a fresh stake at the water's edge, and she measured, and she wrote the measure in a little book, and she watched the green water fall. It fell all that dry summer. It fell a hand's breadth, and then a foot, and then more, as the drought bore down and the sky stayed white and merciless, and the pale ring of exposed stone around the pit grew wider week by week, and the thing that had been sunk for 40 years came, foot by foot, up out of the dark toward the light. There is a particular loneliness in waiting for a thing no one else believes is coming. Ruth Hollis lived that loneliness for the better part of a year. The days were the same, and the days were hard. She rose before light and went into town and did whatever work the day offered, on her knees in other women's gardens, her arms in other women's wash water, and she took the coins and bought her flour and her salt pork and asked for nothing. The town was not cruel to her, exactly, but it had decided what she was, which was a poor, mad girl who had thrown her last dollars down a well. and a town that has decided what you are will not trouble to look again. Children called after her sometimes about her hole full of water. She let them. She had learned from her father the deep patience of a man who works in stone, where nothing is quick and everything worth doing is measured in seasons, and she had learned from her father's ruin the cost of the other thing, the quick fear that does nothing and calls it prudence. She would not be quick, and she would not be afraid. She would measure her stake, and write her number, and watch the water go down. And every evening, no matter how the day had used her, she walked back out to the pit in the long gold light, and drove her fresh stake at the water's shrinking edge. And she knelt and measured from the old stake to the new, and she wrote the fall of the water in her little book, in a small, careful hand, a column of figures growing longer through the summer, each number a little larger than the last, each number the water lower, the truth nearer. On the bad evenings she read back through the column from the beginning all those patient falling numbers, and it studied her. The stone did not lie, and the water did not lie. They were only slow. The town noticed, by and by, that the quarry was dropping. It was a thing people remarked on, the way they remarked on the low creeks and the failing wells, one more strangeness of the terrible dry year. And some of them remembered that the Hollis girl owned the pit now, and a few even walked out to see what she was about, and found her measuring her stakes and writing in her book, and went away shaking their heads, for she would not tell them what she was waiting for. But there was one man in Bishop's Ford who did not shake his head. There was one man who, when he heard that the drowned quarry was falling and that Amos Hollis's daughter sat at its edge measuring the water day by day, felt something cold move through his old bones. Caleb Voss was near 80 now, but he was not soft in the head, and he had spent 40 years not thinking about the drowned quarry, with the particular effort of a man not thinking about the one thing he can never afford to have found. And now the pit was falling, and the stonecutter's daughter was watching it fall. And Caleb Voss, who had not been up to the quarry in 40 years, began to send men out to it, quietly, to see. Ruth Hollis knew he would come. She had known it from the start. She was 18 and alone, and the most powerful man in the county had reason to want the quarry to stay drowned forever. And she understood that when the water fell far enough to give up its secret, she would be in danger, and that her measuring book and her stakes would not be enough. She needed more than the carvings. She needed proof of the thing itself, the flooding, and she had known from the beginning where to look for it. Not in the pit, in the hills. While she waited for the water to fall, Ruth Hollis spent her days walking the high ground above the quarry, following the old dry channel her father had described, up to the ruined dam that no one had looked at closely in 40 years because no one had known to look. And she found it. She found the earthwork dam, worn and grassed over, that had once turned the mountain stream aside from the works. And she found, when she dug into it with a hand trowel over many patient days, the thing that told the tale, that the dam had not failed of itself. It had been cut. There was old tool work in it, buried under 40 years of soil and grass, the marks of bars and mattocks where men had breached it by hand, and the breach was clean and made and deliberate. Nothing at all like the slow slump of an earthwork worn down by time. Ruth Hollis, a stonecutter's daughter, knew tool work from weathering the way her father had known true stone from false. She had found the wound, and it was a wound made by hands. She worked at it the way she worked at everything now, slowly and alone and without hope of anyone's help. Each day after her town work she climbed the hills to the dam and dug a little more, exposing the old breach inch by inch, brushing the soil from the cut faces of the earth with a care that would have looked, to anyone watching, like a woman uncovering a grave. And in a way she was. She was uncovering the buried moment her father had watched from the dark 40 years before, the exact place where 3 men in the night had turned a mountain's water down onto 2 years of a good man's work and the whole life of a town. When at last she had it clear, she sat a long while beside it in the failing light, and she thought about her father, who had seen this done and carried it in silence to his grave, and she found she could not hate him for his silence the way she once had. He had been one frightened man against the man who owned the county. She was one girl against the same. The difference was only that she had the water on her side now, the patient falling water, and a thing to show at the end of the waiting that her father had never had. She made careful drawings of it, the breach and the tool marks and the lay of the channel, measuring each with the same care she gave her stakes. She took a witness, in the end a man she had come to trust, the new young schoolteacher at Bishop's Ford named Daniel Reese, who owed nothing to Caleb Voss and who had a straight look about him and a hatred of a lie. She showed Daniel Reese the cut dam and the tool marks and told him the whole of her father's story, and Daniel Reese, who was an educated man and no fool, walked the channel from the broken dam down to the lip of the quarry, and understood, as her father had understood, that the water of the drowned pit had been sent there on purpose by the hand of man. And then, at the end of that long dry summer, the water fell far enough. It happened on an evening in the failing of the year. Ruth Hollis went out to drive her stake as she did every evening, and in the last of the light she saw, breaking the green surface of the sunken water for the first time in 40 years, the pale curved top of a great carved stone. It rose out of the water like a thing surfacing from sleep, and over the following days. As the drought pressed on and the water kept falling, more of it came clear, and then more, until the deep of the pit gave up what it had hidden for 2 generations, the great finished carvings of the Corliss works, the drowned masterpiece of the master cutter Amos Hollis, come up whole and perfect out of the cold deep water that had preserved them untouched all the years the town had mourned them as lost. They were magnificent. 40 years under water, in the cold and the dark and the still, had not marred them. If anything, the water had kept them cleaner than the open air would have. And when Ruth Hollis and Daniel Reese climbed down the falling stone to stand beside them, they stood beside the finest granite carving either of them had ever seen or ever would. Her father's 2 years of genius, drowned and risen. And on the base of the largest of them, cut in the stone in the master cutter's own hand, was the mark Amos Hollis had cut into every piece he ever finished. His maker's mark, the proof past any doubt of whose work this was and where it had been meant to go. What followed came slowly, the way true justice comes. And Ruth Hollis and Daniel Reese did it carefully and did it right. They did not go to the county sheriff, for the county sheriff owed his office to Caleb Voss. They went past him to the state. Daniel Reese wrote letters, as an educated and respectable man may, to the office at the state capitol that kept the old records of the capitol's building. And it happened that the Capitol Commission was a thing still remembered there, for the state had never gotten the grand carvings it had paid a deposit for, and the loss had been an old sore in the records. When word came back that the drowned Corliss carvings had risen from the pit, whole, bearing the maker's mark, the state sent men out to Bishop's Ford, and they were not men Caleb Voss owned. And Ruth Hollis showed them the pit, and the risen carvings, and then she showed them the hills, and the cut dam, and the tool marks under 40 years of grass. And she laid before them her father's whole account, sworn now and set down in Daniel Reese's careful hand, of what he had seen on the night the works were drowned. And the state's men, who were engineers and lawmen and no friends of Caleb Voss, walked the channel and read the wound in the dam and came to the same understanding every honest person who saw it came to, that the drowning of the Corliss quarry had been no accident, and that the fortune of the most powerful man in the county had been built upon a crime. Caleb Voss was very old by then, and the law is slow, and there is an argument that a man near 80 escapes in the flesh the reckoning that finds him in his name. He did not hang. He did not, in the end, even stand trial, for he died that winter, as very old men who have finally been found out have a way of doing, in his fine house above the town he had ruined. But he died an exposed man, his crime known, his fortune shown to be theft, and the county that had admired his shrewdness for 40 years turned its face from his memory. His bank and his lands came apart in the courts in the years after, and the theft was unwound as far as the law could unwind a 40-year-old wrong. And the descendants of the Corliss Company, and of the workmen ruined in the drowning, got back what could be gotten back. and the carvings went to the capital at last. 40 years late, the state took delivery of the work it had commissioned, the great granite carvings of the Corliss works, and set them where they had always been meant to stand, to crown the Capitol building of the state of Oregon. And beside them the state set a bronze plate that told the true story, that these were the work of the master cutter Amos Hollis of Bishop's Ford, lost 40 years beneath the water of a quarry, drowned by the crime of a man now known, and raised again by the patience and the courage of the cutter's daughter, Ruth Hollis, who never doubted that the truth, like the stone, would keep. Ruth was rewarded. The state paid, at last and with interest, the great sum it had owed for the commission, and by the law of it a good part came to her as her father's only heir and the one who had recovered the work. She was not poor any more. But it was never the money that Ruth Hollis had gone into the drought for, and she did not spend her life as a rich woman idle. She stayed in Bishop's Ford. With her father's due at last in her hands, she did the thing that would have healed his broken heart to see. She reopened the Corliss quarry. The drought had drained it near enough for the work to begin, and Ruth Hollis, who had a stonecutter's eye, though not a stonecutter's arm, hired the cutters and the haulers the dead years had scattered, and brought them home, and set the pale fine granite of Bishop's Ford moving out again by the wagon load to the courthouses and banks and fine houses of the country, as it had in her father's young manhood. The town that had been dying for 40 years drew a breath and began to live. And Ruth Hollis married the schoolteacher Daniel Reese in time, and raised children in a town that had its work back, and grew old there, respected and unhurried, a woman who had waited out a drowned lie with a measuring stake and a little book. She kept her father's maker's mark, the iron stamp he had cut every finished stone with, on the mantel of her house until the end of her days. And when the young ones asked her how it had all begun, she would tell them the truth, which was the only thing she had ever cared to deal in. She had been 18 years old, and cast out, and down to $3 knotted in a handkerchief, and she had spent every cent of it on a hole full of water that the whole town swore was worth nothing at all. It was the best $3 she ever spent. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the risen stone or the fallen man, though those are the parts the town remembers. It is that the truth is patient in a way that lies never are. A lie has to be maintained, it needs the water kept high, the dam kept hidden, the pit kept full, and it costs the liar something to hold it under, year after year, forever, but the truth only has to wait. It lay 40 years at the bottom of the cold water, the drowned carvings and the cut dam both, and it did not rot, and it did not change, and it did not lose its shape, and when at last the water fell, it was still there, whole, exactly as it had always been, waiting to be seen by anyone with the patience to watch the water go down. So we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. Is there a truth in your own life or your family's that has lain a long time under the water, waiting for the drought that will bring it up into the light? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.